everybody, it is Katie here from the Queen of Teen Fiction, and it is time to tell you what I've been reading throughout November. I feel so bad because I only read 2 books in November. NaNoWriMo completely ate up all of my time last month. Even when I did sit down to read, I couldn't properly focus on what I was reading because all I wanted to do was write my own things, and so my reading took a real backseat last month. I don't remember the last time I only read 2 books in a month. That never happens! I've been so deprived of other people's fictional worlds. I'm so disappointed in myself. But anyway, one of the books I did read was a fairly huge book, so technically it could have been 3. I mean, it was a book that was over 600 pages, and on average the books I read are about 300 pages, so it could have been 3 books. But anyway, the first book that I read this month is No Virgin by Anne Cassidy. This book was read as a part of the book club that I'm in. This was our November read that we discussed at the end of the month. It was sent out to us by the wonderful people at Hotkey Books. This book is about rape. And obviously it's not a nice subject to read about, but it is definitely an important one. And we don't get nearly enough YA books that deal with this kind of stuff well. Anne Cassidy is an author that I've been reading since I was about 13 or 14. I used to read her books a lot when I was in high school. I love her way of telling stories. In this book she writes about a character named Stacey. She's having a hard time at home because her youngest sister has had a baby, and the responsibility of that hasn't really hit home for her sister. So she keeps forcing the baby onto Stacey and her mother, and Stacey is really sick of it. She ends up having a big fallout with her mum and her sister, and she storms out of the house. She goes to stay at her dad's for the night, and then the next morning when she's at a coffee shop, she ends up meeting a boy called Henry. Henry is completely different to Stacey. It's like he's from another world entirely because he's pretty upper class. He goes to a private, expensive school. It's pretty clear that he's got money, and he just focuses all of his attention on Stacey. Stacey wants to be a fashion designer, and Henry has connections at Selfridges, so he takes her to go and see the person that he knows working there. They kind of bond during this time, and then he ends up offering her a place to stay while she figures out how to talk to her mum and her sister. I don't want to go into the details about what happens in this book because I think that it's a book that everyone should read for themselves because it's such an important story and because we need to read books like this. This book really reiterates how much the victim isn't to blame in situations like this. This book ends quite suddenly after Stacey decides to call the Rape Crisis Centre. At first I was disappointed because what I really wanted to see was the aftermath and whether it went to court, and I wanted to see whether justice was brought. But I didn't know at the time that there is going to be a sequel, and that sequel will deal with the fallout from everything. So I was very happy to find out that there is going to be another book that deals with that, because I think that's also a really important part of telling a story about rape. We need to hear more stories about the victims coming forward and getting their voices heard, because so many of these attacks go unpunished, and it's really horrible to think about, but it happens all the time. So I'm really excited to see what the sequel brings. So the second book and final book that I read in November is Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy, and it is by Cassandra Clare with 3 other authors as well: Sarah Reese Brennan, Maureen Johnson and Robin Waisman. If you've never read The Mortal Instruments before, then this book would be completely lost on you and you probably will not know what I'm talking about at all. But if you've read The Mortal Instruments, then you will know what this is, probably. This book, and it is a very huge book, follows Simon Lewis after the events in City of Heavenly Fire, which is the final book in the Mortal Instruments series. Simon arrives at the academy and is training to be a shadow hunter, and this book is basically a compilation of various short stories that tell his journey through these 2 years at this academy. The story doesn't just focus on Simon and the new friends that he makes at the academy. We also get to see plenty of characters that are already familiar to us from the Mortal Instruments and the Infernal Devices. We see characters from the Dark Artificers as well, and we also get introduced to characters that we will meet in Cassie's next series, The Last Hours. Whilst I've brought that up, I do want to talk about that one. I wasn't really that excited about The Last Hours because at the moment I'm very focused on the Dark Artificers and I want to finish reading that story and find out what happens to those characters before we jump into The Last Hours, and I wasn't sure whether Cassie was going to do what she did with the Mortal Instruments and the Infernal Devices, where she jumps back and forth between the series, because when that happened it meant that we'd have a 2-year wait for another Mortal Instruments book because she had to get an Infernal Devices book out of the way so that the stories could intermingle, kind of. I was really hoping that that wouldn't happen with The Last Hours because I just want to get the Dark Artificers out of the way. There are so many Shadowhunter books. It's hard to keep track of them all. I feel like I will never be free. But yeah, The Last Hours just seemed so far off in the distance and I didn't really want to focus on more characters within this world at the moment. So it's not something that I've ever really got excited for. But then I ended up reading this, and one of the short stories introduces us to a younger James Herondale who is going to be one of the main characters in The Last Hours, and we get introduced to his future parabatai, Matthew Fairchild, and this story is about them starting at the Shadowhunter Academy. Meeting them in the short story completely made me fall in love with them. I didn't really care about those characters until I read this, and now I am complete trash for them, and I can't wait to get to The Last Hours now. So my favourite short story in this book is Born to Endless Night, which if you were in this fandom then you will know it's more about Malik than it is anything else. You already know how trash I am for Malik, so it was odds on that that story was going to be my favourite, but it really was great and I thought it was the funniest one and it was the one that brought all the characters together, so yeah. It was a blessing. So these stories were released as ebooks. They released them the same way they did with the Bane Chronicles. It was like one a month over the space of a year almost. But with the Bane Chronicles I knew that it would be available in physical copy at some point as well. So I decided not to read the ebooks as they were released because I wanted to read the physical copy. It's just easier, and also I couldn't afford to buy an ebook each month, so I was always going to wait for this one. But then Lady Midnight happened, and there's a short story at the end of Lady Midnight that literally spoils one of the major events in the end of this book. So when I was going into this book I already knew the fate of one of the main characters, and it did kind of a little bit take away from the reading experience because I knew what was going to happen to this character. I kind of wish that it hadn't been put in Lady Midnight, but it was. It was still completely heartbreaking to read. I just wish that I hadn't known that already because I think it would have had a lot more impact on me emotionally rather than me going into that final story dreading what was going to happen because I knew. But that was the only problem that I had with it really, and it's not really a problem with this, it's a problem with Lady Midnight. Why do that? Why? So yeah, if you love the Shadowhunter world, then you will love the writing within this book because it's always witty and the characters are always great. And like I said, it's a huge book, so yeah. Technically I got a lot of reading done, even though it was only 2 books. So that is all I managed to get through in November. I have a lot of books that I need to catch up on in December, so I'm hoping to settle down with those this month. Please do let me know what you've been reading throughout November and what you plan to read in the run up to Christmas. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you next time. Bye!